Hey there, everybody. Welcome to week 2. So we are out of the gate with our course on relational care and made our way into week 2. So I hope the week 1 material resonated a bit with you and you're able to connect somehow to that material and let it, I guess the best way is to just kind of let it simmer and see how it sits with you. And really, the week 1 material is hopefully a bit foundational for us really get into the meat and the heart and the purpose of this course. And so week 2, the official title for week 2, Compassion as a Necessary Movement Towards Wholeness, the Wisdom Pattern, Part 1. And so the wisdom pattern comes from the book we're reading this week called The Wisdom Pattern. And it, as you make your way through, we're reading part 1 this week and week 2, and then week 3 we read part 2. But this book gets into this wisdom pattern of understanding order and then a disorder and then a reorder that follows. And there's so much to this, and I hope you can put it into the context of your personal life as well as your professional life. Because that's really the purpose of this course is for you to try to relate to this material in your personal life, and then from there let it move into your professional life. So let's really the goal is to try to connect with this in our own personal experiences and information that we have up to this point in life, and then see if we can transfer this to our professional life so that, there really is just one life experience that has all of it connected and an understanding of it, all of it from that perspective. What we're doing, of course, as I mentioned, we're reading part 1, but then there's also a couple extra readings. The Cosmic Egg we will be reading, and then as well as, and those are just short pieces. And the Cosmic Egg actually is in chapter 5, maybe it is, in our book. But then also dualistic and non-dualistic thinking, which is also in the embedded in the book too. I just wanted to pull those pieces out and read separate parts to those because they have really important connotations to how we're trying to come to terms with this notion of self-care and how we look at the world in that way. So what I thought I would do, without making a video that's 3 hours long, is to keep this to really no more than a half hour total, hopefully, but really review some of these pieces of what's in the book, and then what that means to us in our personal life, but then also the professional life of medicine, because there's so much crossover here. So from an overview of the course standpoint, again, the purpose of this course really is to take a serious look at self-care. And by serious, I mean, moving beyond the tinkering, and again, I mean that in the most loving way possible, because most of my career has been talking about tinkering, but moving towards a transformation. The tinkering aspects are, as we said before, are necessary, and they're good. But they just don't seem to be taking us far enough to move us to a point of true happiness and well-being and satisfaction with our personal life and our professional life and so forth. So really that movement towards transformation is what we're hoping to get an understanding from for this course. So again, the backdrop, maybe I should say it that way, for this course in relational care is in the broader context of our initiative on compassion. And compassion, not just as a physician who is working with a patient who is suffering, but from a personal standpoint also of compassion for ourselves, compassion for our profession, compassion for our colleagues, our family members, and so forth. So in the broadest context of compassion, and it seems to me that this movement towards compassion is a very much a movement in the importance of connectedness and relationality, and that being, as we talked about in last week, is that relational exchange, this back and forth flow. So those components we're going to hold on to and carry those through in our understanding of how do we move in this direction of transformation, because that idea of connectedness and relationality are really important concepts there. Compassion, as we talked about also, doesn't exist without suffering. And in order for us really to get our arms around suffering and move towards compassion, we kind of need to know a little bit more about why suffering exists in the context of our current lifetime. And if you're reading the latest news and headlines and just, I think, probably just being a participant in life, you'll probably have appreciated the idea that loneliness is probably the new suffering of our lifetime, that it transcends everywhere. It doesn't seem to matter the demographic of the individual, but that suffering seems to transcend everywhere. And again, moving loneliness, transcends this, and moving this to idea of compassion. This is about connectedness and relationality, and that's kind of how those fit together. One of the things that, before I get into this too far here, and again, I'm going to really just skim over some of these highlights of the book. The book, as you will appreciate, is written from a Christian perspective, but you don't have to be Christian to understand or appreciate the concepts. I think what is discussed in the book, although related a lot to Christian theology, or maybe Christian spirituality is probably a better way to say it, is really ubiquitous across all the great religions. All of the great religions seem to be saying the same thing relative to being connected and relationship and compassion and the other topics, especially the topic about suffering that we're going to talk about today. So I just wanted to put that out there, that if you're not Christian, totally okay. You don't have to be Christian to read and appreciate this book. If you're not religious in any definition of the way you might define religion, or if you're not spiritual, also okay. The context of the book, I think, is ubiquitous across you just living life in the way that we do with your experiences. We'll be able to relate to the concepts here. The part one of this book starts with postmodernism, and it's a really good place to start because it gives us, a starting point for us to understand from an anthropological and sociological groundwork of why we seem to be in the situation we're in relative to suffering, whether that's from anxiety or loneliness, or maybe professional burnout, or just plain unhappiness. Understanding the postmodern era that we're in now, and really with some context to the modern era that came before it, is really important to know how we got to where we are and why we feel as a society the way we do. And so this book spends a lot of time talking in part one, actually threaded through part one, about postmodernism. So I just want you to kind of pay attention to some of the themes there. You may have learned some of this in your undergraduate studies if you've taken sociology or anthropology courses. But it certainly applies to the context of us living in the here and now, and also very much so in the practice of medicine. So when you read postmodernism, don't tune it out if you didn't appreciate it when you were an undergrad taking your some of your prerequisite courses for medical school, but try to relate it in the context of your own life and see if you can appreciate some of the context and the themes that are there. So then looking at, again, the probably the most common theme of this book, and really I would probably say the most common theme of this course is suffering. And in the wisdom pattern of order, disorder, reorder, it's that disorder part that we're really focusing on, so that we can understand why we feel the way we do relative to the order, and why we hope that we're moving towards a reorder or something new. And so a lot of this first part of the book, certainly part one, is talking about suffering in some context anyway. And a lot of times I'll use that language, suffering, but it's used in many different ways. So we can talk about it as disorder also. And that's why I wanted to give the example of probably the new suffering of our lifetime that transcends everyone is the idea of loneliness. And so there's a lot been written about that, again, especially from our Surgeon General, who's trying to make sure that we, particularly as healthcare professionals, understand what this looks like for the patients that we serve. One of the other pieces too, without getting into the details yet, is talking about the idea of moving towards transformation. And many people will agree that in a movement towards transformation, we need to move beyond the tinkering pieces of our life that we generally try to focus on, and get to something that has more depth and meaning. And there's really two ways, it seems, to get there, and that is one through love and the other through suffering. And when we pull this back to the broader view of the holism view, the love and the suffering come together, and they're really both parts of the same whole, both necessary and both existing at the same time. And both very much there in our movement towards transformation. And so one of the things you'll hear me say a lot about in this course is trying to live in the tension of paradox. And it seems most things that are meaningful are paradoxical in some ways. And so love and suffering seem to be opposites, but I think and because most of the time our rational minds can't wrap around how love and suffering can exist at the same time. But I think if we can step that back into our more unitive consciousness, non-dual mind that we'll read about, this week too in some of the material, that we see that they, in a holism perspective, they exist at the same time and are both necessary in our movement towards transformation. And so this is why we're going to spend so much time on suffering, because it is, that piece that ties it together with compassion and moves us towards transformation. Again, the course is focused on self-care for us, for you as an individual, and coming to terms with your own suffering and the patterns that you see in your own life is a big part of this course, is reflecting through that. Okay, so one more piece. I got my notes here. So one more piece before we get to the first chapter, but it is one of the things to kind of think about, a common theme to think about also as we go through the material for the course, is that perhaps an antidote to the confusion, the chaos, the paralysis that we sometimes feel in life is a return to the simplicity. Simplicity is usually something that's right in front of us, and it is usually a movement towards being connected and a movement towards relationality. So whenever we are in these situations that we would consider, of some type of suffering, it's likely, anxiousness or depression or fear or whatever it might be, thinking about it from a personal, perspective, but also in our professional lives as well. Returning to the simplicity is always a good antidote to working through what we're feeling in that way. And so that then is returning to the connection, usually with people, with ourselves, with nature, with God, even with maybe our institution that we may be unhappy with at the time, and getting back to that basic level of relationship. And in medicine, it really, we're talking about it from a compassion side. So when we're with a patient and we're feeling that perhaps confusion and chaos and paralysis, that a movement towards compassion, towards connection with that individual is always a movement in the right direction. And so we'll talk more about that, because it's a balance between both being an expert and knowing, the medical side of things, but also managing this other side at the same time. Okay, so chapter 1 talks about postmodernism, and really, hopefully you'll get an appreciation for this. Is about coming off the modern era of that we have control and we know. Okay, intellectually we know because we know science, and we know based on the research, and all of us have that same background in that way, and it gives us a lot of great comfort to know in that way and to be certain. And that was the modern era, but then we moved into this postmodernism, and it's just massive unknowing, and that maybe there isn't anything I can be sure about or certain about, and so there's this great skepticism that postmodernism is hanging its hat on. But hopefully this course will have you come to appreciate there's a lot of other ways of knowing other than just intellectual. So this is one of the reasons why we're doing a contemplative sit each week, is that it helps us to know in ways other than just through our minds. There are other ways of knowing. And this is, moving ourselves beyond this just intellectual thing that we come to so greatly love in the modern era, and then so greatly despise, I think, as many have said it, in the postmodern era. But the unknowing being realized in the postmodernism world really is a disorder. So looking at this pattern, again, we're going to be looking at patterns, is what we're trying to do in this course. The patterns of order, disorder, reorder. Order very much describes what the modern era looked like. Disorder very much describes what the postmodern era looks like. So if you look at it from the broader context, sometimes we look at this order, disorder, reorder pattern in our own personal lives and in small situations. But you also pull this out to a macro level and look at it from this perspective and say we're very much in a disordered state as a society in postmodernism right now. And so it really describes us giving up control, of this as a way to manage this. And this is another theme, is transformation seems to really only be able to move forward when we're willing to give up some control, and be not be able to be certain about everything as we move forward. It's very difficult as a provider, because you need to know and need to be in control in that context, but at the same time living in the tension of maybe giving up some control in another way. All the great things that we know are paradoxical, it seems, and so it's not knowing and unknowing at the same time. And where we're moving towards, again, the transformation is sometimes called a third way, and that's part 2 of this book, or next week. But the third way is knowing and not knowing at the same time, holding the opposites, and moving beyond that either or dualism, and being able to live in both spaces at the same time. So that's kind of a recap in my thoughts about chapter 1. Chapter 2 moves is talking about beyond victimhood, and this is understanding. To understand compassion, we must understand suffering, and to understand suffering, we must understand victimhood. And this applies to both our personal life, but also our professional life. Certainly, we could feel victims of the healthcare system in some ways, and a lot of physicians do, a lot of healthcare professionals do, that they're unhappy with their their jobs and their professional life because the healthcare system has made them feel like a victim. And so what hopefully this chapter is doing is moving us beyond this victimhood mentality. But it's also important for us to realize that our patients feel like this too. So we feel like it in our personal lives, our patients feel like it in their personal lives. We feel like it in our professional lives, so do our patients. One of the separate pieces I mentioned earlier is that we're talking about dualism and non-dualism. And so dualism is looking at things that are either or, for instance, fight or flight. But there is a third way for that, and it's really a non-dual way of thinking and moving through. And that's our week 3. But also it goes into the only way we can move to that idea of non-dualism is to be living into our true self. And largely when we feel like we're victimized, we're living in this ego, small self piece, as Rohr talks about. But living into our true self moves us beyond that and pushes us into the third way, or a reordered or a transformation state. And talking about the true self is something that we will spend a lot more time on in week 4, because we're going to read a book specifically about that. So transformation is the objective, and it happens through, as I mentioned, great love or great suffering, and usually both, and most of the time both. So the disordered piece is a pattern, hopefully, that we, the last point I wanted to make about this chapter is that it seems to be a recurring theme through life in many different situations, small or big, that there is a disorder there. Most of the time when it happens, we seem to be shocked, that it's there, or we seem to be surprised, and why is the suffering there? Why is the disorder there? But if we can look at it in the context of recurring patterns in all kinds of ways, I think we will find that we probably shouldn't be shocked or surprised, that it is part of the lived experience of our humanness, and that it is something that is important, that moves us into a transformation or a true happiness piece. And so, the last piece about this in chapter 2, the Beyond Victimhood, is trying to recognize those patterns, so we're not necessarily surprised or shocked that when something arises that puts us in a disordered state. Chapter 3 is on Great Awakening, and this is, as I was reading through this again and taking some notes about this, it's, kind of knowing what we don't know. Knowing medicine. So here's the paradox is, in the profession of medicine, knowing medicine certainly is something that there's, great importance for. But then it's also balanced with the not knowing other things, and perhaps not knowing a big part of life. Knowing the science of medicine, but maybe not the reality of what our patients or even of what we are experiencing. And from my experience of working with physicians in lots of context of being overworked and burned out and unhappiness and struggling with mental health, it's balancing those two things together. How do I balance the knowing and the having to be in control of my professional job with the unknowing that is always present? That we don't want to allow ourselves to feel like we aren't in control, or there isn't a piece of our life that isn't something that I can completely know and understand. Because our training certainly pushes us towards knowing as much, or if not everything. And I think that context is difficult to come to terms with. And so that's the Great Awakening. And hopefully we all get there at some point. It's like, wow, there's a lot I don't know. And I'm okay with that. I can come to terms with that. I accept that. And I can let go of my need to know, everything. If we can get there, if we can start letting go, not holding on to, not clinging to this need to know everything, and needing to have our ego need to know everything, or the perception that other people think I know everything. If we can get there and start letting that go, then we can really make a major movement towards transformation, or the third way. So the disorder is, as Rohr says, the falling apart experience, and also calls it a sacred wound, I think, which is a really important and good word for this. But most of us refuse to let things fall apart because we want to hold on to it, be in control, cling, and refuse to be wounded because it has this notion of weakness and vulnerability associated with this. And that's not part of the social context of being a healthcare professional, certainly a physician. So it's something that we really try to hold on and cling to, but it doesn't seem like there's any other way to move towards transformation than to let that go. And that woundedness is essential, and accepting that the woundedness is there allows it to be a sacred wound. And if we can trust the pain and not just try to get rid of it, but trust it until the lessons are learned, then that suffering, then the suffering that is the disorder, then starts moving towards the reorder, then starts moving towards this transformation, or this third way, this other way of knowing that is so much more expansive than our small way of knowing, our small intellectual, small self way of knowing. So the disorder, suffering, and woundedness are all really necessary parts of life. And it's about what we do with the experience that makes all the difference there in what we do. So that's the Great Awakening. And then we can move towards transformation in chapter 4. And it's always the process of letting go. Transformation is always that process of letting go and not clinging to, not holding on to, not trying to manage and control. If you wonder why we do a contemplative sit, that contemplative exercise, or the centering prayer, as it's also called, it's practice for letting go. Because the purpose of that is not to see how long you can sit there and not have a thought come through your head, but it is practice of letting the thought go, just when it comes in, of just letting it go. There's something that is a training exercise there with that. Yes, it's got all the benefits of a meditation practice, but it's a practice also of letting go and being okay with letting go. It's a continual letting go, as you have experienced, that it is perhaps 100 or more times in a just a contemplative sit that you have, that you're practicing letting go. And that's the purpose of doing that, and hopefully that will continue for you as, not an experience that is frustrating or causes negative emotion, and that's often the way it is when it starts, and perhaps it should start like that, but then coming to terms with it and realizing that this is just the way it is. I just have to continue to let it go. Then that transfers to other parts of your life. It's part of the great secret sauce, if you will, of a contemplative exercise. So live in the chaos and the confusion for a while. This is the piece of transformation that's important. Live with that tension of not being in control. Don't be too quick to chase it away, or to run from it, or certainly to project it, those fears and anxieties, onto other people. Usually our loved ones take the brunt of that. But just let it rest and let it be, and live into it. And then on its own time, you'll find yourself in a new place, and that's transformation. If you can let it be and let it go, then on its own time, and not try, you will find yourself in a new place, not trying too quickly to push it away or to run from it. It's not about the order and control and predictability This is all about letting go, and that's a transformation process. So that's really the difference between tinkering and transformation, is the controllability of tinkering versus the letting go and the letting go of control that is transformation. So postmodernism is a great example of running away and projecting. It seems like that is what it is built upon, a skepticism there of projecting, this is somebody else's fault, or, trying to run away from issues and not relying on anything secure and solid. But there is a pattern there. If we can move beyond what we're seeing from the media, that there is a pattern there that we are recognizing, this disordered pattern. Let's stay here with the tension, and we may have to stay for a while. On its own time, we will end up in someplace new. So then through disorder, we get to transformation or reorder, and this is certainly by letting go. Okay, so then moving to chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5 is on the cosmic egg. We have a separate reading on that. Really cool the way this is laid out by Rohr, that we have our own story, my story. This is about me, and this is kind of where we start in life. Everything is about me, and we see that certainly in little kids and young adults, and sometimes older adults too, that life still revolves just around me, and I only see life through my story. But then if we continue to grow, then we evolve into something that would be our story. So we see people who are like me, and then I'm part of something bigger than me, and I recognize that there's something more than just me, but there's others like me out here. And that's another evolution, as we move into this next phase, I would say, of maturity and growth, is that we have an our story. Okay, but the our story too can have a downside, because then there are people who we see as not like us. They're not in our group. They don't belong to the club, and so we have that othering thing going. But if we keep moving through this maturity process, as Rohr talks about, then we get to the story, and we start seeing that we're all part of one great whole, and that everything is included and everything belongs. And the thing to think about this is to not say that the my story, our story, are not important, because they are. Those belong, and those still are present in some way, and still have a place probably too in some way, as we continue to move on to the big story, the story. And so it's all part of the same whole and all necessary. And then finally, chapter 6, which is the last chapter that's in part 1, is about cleaning the lenses, and this allows us to see. Okay, so this is also the other one of the other great pieces of doing contemplative exercises, like the contemplative sit. It doesn't allow us to know more information, for instance, but it allows us to know with more of ourselves, is probably the way to say it. There's a way of knowing that moves much beyond our small intellectual way of knowing. And we experience this from doing contemplative exercises. So it allows us to see, and allows us to move beyond intellectual through contemplation. It's not knowing more, but knowing with more of ourselves. And then once we get there, with this cleaning of the lenses then we have some clarity to move towards transformation, which would be towards the reorder, or the third way, as Rohr talks about it a lot in this book. So part 2 is actually the third way. So when we get to week 3, we're going to talk about the third way more there, and what that means. Whew, that was a lot. So just about 35 minutes of content here. My advice is to work with this material. The challenge for this course is it goes so quickly that you kind of read through it and try to grab it and hope something sticks. My advice would be to reread it at some point, continue to reflect on the material, how it applies to your own life, personally and professionally, and how it might apply to your patient's life or your family member's life, or your coworkers. So look forward to reading your reflections and to the discussions as well. Let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.